All right, guys, today I'm here with Kyle. He is from Sober Dogs. You can find him on Instagram, TikTok, other social media channels, YouTube at Sober Dogs. And what I want to talk to Kyle about today is what I would call an epidemic that's happening in high schools when it comes to substance use. But I don't think it's the type of drug use that I think it looks differently than it used to back even when I was in school, and maybe when you were in high school and stuff like that. So, Kyle, right off the bat, what do you see students struggling with the most? Like, what type of substances are you coming across most often in high schools?
Thanks for having me on, Doc. I appreciate it. So it's definitely changed, from what I've seen, just like you mentioned back in our day, so to speak. But social media is a real big one. Anything to do with basically technology being a big distraction / addiction, vaping of all different sorts. So, it's obviously the marijuana vaping, and then nicotine is a big one. And then a couple that aren't, I kind of talk about them when I go in and speak as like people wouldn't maybe think about some of the students. Caffeine, the Celsius, the pre-workout, the coffee, any of that in general. And caffeine's always a big one, or just kind of over-the-counter stimulants, I would say. That's one that people don't usually think about. Gaming, and then online gambling. It's just, these are things, they're almost in our society like accepted because it's legal and available and free, and like mom and dad might do it, or Uncle Bobby. But I don't think people realize the effect they're having, especially on these young kids.
Yeah, I can agree with more with you on that. I want to dive into some of these particularly. Let's start with talking about nicotine and cannabis use. Nowadays in the high schools, most of the cannabis use is in the form of the cartridges, right? At least that's what I see a lot, like in the vape cartridges or the dab pens or the Pendjamins, whatever the kids are calling things these days. And tell me, from your point of view, what are you more concerned about as someone who has experience in the substance use prevention space? Are you more worried about the nicotine products or the cannabis products? If we were just to take those two side by side, which ones alarm you more?
I personally would say the nicotine ones. My reasoning for that, as a nicotine user myself, I experience the effects of it daily, and how incredibly difficult it is to quit, and how it just branches out. From when I started using nicotine at the age of the kids I go speak to, 15, 16, I have now, over the course of the last 20 years, chewed tobacco, used pouches, smoked cigarettes, smoked cigars, vape, like nicotine in any and every form. And it is one of the hardest things to quit. And it's also a very sneaky kind of addiction, where exactly like I speak with the kids about, the first time I smoked a cigarette, I took one hit of it and then that's it. Nothing happened for a month. It wasn't like I started smoking a pack a day, but that opened the door. And then the next time it was a little bit. And then 6 months later, I'm having 3 or 4 a night at a party, and it just builds up slowly. And again, it's one of those things that's, cigarettes not so much anymore, but vapes, it's just accepted. And it's so easy. I never smoked a cigarette in the house. When I smoked vape, I vape in my house, I vape on the bed. So I feel like we're getting an excessive amount of nicotine compared to what it was in the past, on top of it being a pretty unregulated market, to where we don't know exactly what's going in the vapes.
Yeah, I think the lack of regulation is a big thing. A lot of people come at me and be like, well, vaping's safer than smoking. I'm like, what vape is safer than smoking? Because I want to see the study that says a Rick and Morty, vape from China compared to cigarettes. I'm like, can you show me someone who smoked a Rick and Morty vape for 20 years? And, a lot of people don't realize that when Juul was popular, Juul was in the process of suing, I think it was like 32 Chinese companies producing fake Juuls and distributing them all throughout the US. So I say to people, like, maybe it's safer than smoking, but like, to your point, there's such a wide variety of brands. There's thousands of different brands. Who knows what brands are actually valid and what are not? Because if you buy vapes, they all have these authentication codes on them and things like that to try and make sure that's a legitimate product, because there's so many knockoff products coming off. So I think it's so hard to argue that that's actually safe. And I'll just ask you. So you said you find nicotine to be more problematic. I would say nicotine is definitely in higher use than cannabis, although cannabis has a very high use in high schools that I see. Yeah. But I think more people use nicotine than cannabis. Why do you think it became so popular in high schools? What is it you think they love about vapes? Is it the ease of it? Is it the flavors? What do you think sucks so many kids in high school into this?
I think it's a combination of all that, but there's this general tendency with so many of us, myself, included in high school, to where it's like, I think to get back a little bit of our control, maybe, or our independence, like you want to push back a little bit, or something you could do to be separated from, you're just getting to those teen years, and you want to kind of be yourself. So if there's somebody vaping in the bathroom or outside after school or something, it's like a little bit of like, I'm my own person. I'm my own adult. Now let me try it one. And then when you open that door, it is a lot easier than in the past, where maybe somebody did that with a cigarette. Typically they taste pretty bad. You're going to cough. You smell pretty, bad afterwards. With a vape, just to your point, the flavors. So it's, this thing tastes good. And then for somebody like myself, it becomes this feedback loop of negativity where I vape when I'm more anxious, and then the vape makes me more anxious. And then I hit the vape, and it's this constant loop. So I think once a kid kind of opens that door, it doesn't taste that good. Maybe it's a little thing I could hide from mom and dad and feel my own independence. And then the ease of access of being able to do it, in the bathroom, in my room at night without anyone smelling it. There's just a little cherry flavor. If I'm a teen, it builds up. And then, as we know, once the addiction starts, it just becomes this loop of, I need more and more of it, and, use it. Good day, bad day, in between day, I'm hitting that. So then every habit becomes entwined with it.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. So obviously, like you said, these kids, they're younger, they're in the control of the school system and their parents. Makes sense. So maybe some of them do it for that reason. What do you think, and have you found, and there's not a right answer to this, I can't say I found it 100% either, but what do you think is an effective messaging, or what's the messaging that you try and get across to teens when you're talking to them? Do you go in there talking about the health consequences and the health scares? What are you talking to teens about when you're talking about nicotine addiction to try and strike a chord with them?
So there's a couple of things. That's trying to connect is a big one with them. One of the things I do, it seems to be effective now, is talking about who's running these things. There seems to be a big push, not just now. I mean, it seems kind of always been with that teen age group, but you don't want to be controlled by some big company or corporation or whatever. So one of the things I do talk about is the goal of many of these companies, which now many of the vape companies are owned by the past cigarette companies, is to get you to just try that vape a couple times as a teen. Because if they can open the door, then they're in the future going to have a Kyle Ruggieri, who for 20 years has used nicotine on and off in a dozen ways. That seems to hit with them pretty hard, because it's like they don't want, the big bad corporation who's already taking a bunch of money and running, things to kind of control them. The other thing I do hit on and talk about with them is, I don't want this to sound bad, but at least when I used heroin, I got something, and I'm talking to them about nicotine, and I'm like, after the first couple times, there's no effect. It's just pretty much nothing. It is a waste. It's just a pointless addiction that I'm hooked on, that costs a ton of money. Money's always a good one too, that connects with people, how much it just drains your pocket. And it's not as if I take a hit of it in the next 5-6 hours, I'm relieved, as if maybe having a couple beers, even though I don't drink. Again, not that that's healthy, but I got something from it versus the vape. You don't get anything, after the beginning.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. I find when I work with students, especially at a younger age, you're usually not experiencing, although I will say with vaping, some of them are experiencing health effects at a very young age. They'll be like, I can't breathe. And I'm like, that's crazy, because someone who smokes cigarettes usually isn't saying that till they're like 30s, 40s, 50s, and you're 18 and you're telling me you can't breathe. But I agree with you. It's usually not the health effects. It's usually that mindset stuff. And I like how you worded that. You're flipping it's interesting to think that maybe someone is doing it for a sense of control and then telling them, hey, you're not actually gaining a sense of control. You're just handing your control over to someone else, i.e. a big tobacco company, a vape company. So I'm really into that stuff. That's a lot of what I try and hammer away at, because the health stuff, especially at a young age, like you said, it's just not as prominent. I mean, they should be educated on it and they should know, but if you're not feeling it, it's like harder to relate to it. Like, well, this guy says I'm not going to be able to breathe, but I breathe fine right now and I'm vaping, so he's wrong. Which I get. Now, I'll say this out there too. Do you think, so here's the thing, right? We go in, we do these seminars, and the reality is, like, a lot of people still struggle with nicotine addiction. So the other thing that I feel is, like, I feel like there needs to be a few things, more of a clear path to, like, actually helping the students stop. So, like, here's the information. It's controlling you. It's damaging your health. It's doing all these things. But now here's a path that you can work on to stopping. Mm-hmm. And I always felt that was lacking. And that could be a harm reduction path. It could be education on nicotine replacement therapy and educating parents on that. It could be working with their doctor for a medication if there was one out there that seemed appropriate. It could be educating them about books that are out there on it. Alan Carr's Easy Way to Quit Smoking, The Freedom Model, Escaping the Addiction and Recovery Trap. Like, I feel like that follow-up is always lacking, because even if you get, like, a student to stop, so you go in, you get them all hyped up, they're ready to quit. A week goes by, their friends are vaping in the bathroom. Maybe like drinking, it's a social thing. Yeah, I'm on break. I'm just going to go hit my vape with my friends. So maybe there is that social benefit to them in the moment. And then they're like, yeah, I forgot what Kyle said about all that stuff. Yeah. Whatever, this is good. So do you notice that in schools? Do you feel that there's not that follow-up? Do you feel that there needs to be more follow-up?
Absolutely. That's a great point. 100%. Because, as with almost any addiction or any big change in life, there's that motivational moment, but that goes away. But if there's, actual steps in place, and I find this with myself as well, if there's a plan or steps in place that makes it so much easier to follow through. Because when it's just open-ended, I'm not going to, follow when I walk out to my car. But if, we sat down and implemented a plan where usually when I get in my car, the first thing I do is vape. Now I'm going to follow the little plan that we had. A, I got rid of the vape. B, now I carry these peppermints with me whenever I have a craving. I do that. It makes it so much easier to get through, those first couple day periods where it's really bad. And as you speak about all the time, those periods where, like, day 7, day 21, there's these certain big milestones that can be really hard. But if I have a plan in place, it makes it so much easier. And I don't see that at all with many of the schools.
I don't either. And I think that's hugely lacking. Now, I'll jump on to another topic here. So vaping, I think, is a bigger problem. Personally, I'm more concerned with cannabis than I am nicotine. And this is why. When I have a student who's vaping, outside of any immediate health consequences, which is usually like breathing issues, lung issues, a collapsed lung, something like that, I think the reality is a lot of people can live with nicotine addiction and continue to prosper. So, like, if you're heavy into alcohol, heavy into heroin, heavy into other drugs, life can go south pretty fast, right? You lose your job, you lose your health, you're in and out of the hospital, maybe there's overdose potential. With nicotine, that's not so much the case. Like, I'm like, okay, realistically, if this kid quits today or if they quit 5 years from now, they'll probably be all right. They'll have wasted money, they'll have wasted health and time they can't get back, but like they'll probably be all right. Now with cannabis, obviously now we're seeing like much stronger concentrations. We have the same like black market product problems that we do with vapes, where God knows what type of oils people are doing and coming up with in their homes and distributing to these kids. But the thing that I'm concerned with cannabis is the high potency stuff. I see it send them into such a negative downward spiral so fast. Like, and even as far as going into episodes of psychosis and psychotic behavior. And that's super concerning to me when I see what goes on with schools and the violence and the shootings. And like a lot of these autopsy reports are like, oh, no substances found except for THC, but we're going to brush over that autopsy on the shooter. THC was there, but that wasn't it. I'm like, well, damn, there's a reoccurring theme though, again and again to some of these things. So for me, and there, again, there isn't a right or a wrong answer to this, I tend to be more concerned with cannabis because with the higher concentration stuff now, I feel like I see a faster downward spiral in those individuals than I do the individuals addicted to nicotine products. Do you have any like, any feedback on that, or do you agree or disagree with that observation? Or
I totally agree with the downward spiral happening quicker. The reason I may have, I may be a little jaded towards the nicotine side is I'm an active nicotine user. So it's kind of on my mind daily. And then when I do go in there and speak, I show them, I show the vape and we talk about it. So then afterwards, the kids who are vaping always come up and want to talk and ask questions and maybe send me social media stuff a week later. So that's probably more of the world I'm in, where I do talk about marijuana. But the kids who are maybe struggling with that don't reach out as much because I'm not showing a, THC vape and saying I also struggle with this at the moment. So that makes complete sense. And to your point, I have seen, and this is not just with kids, friends, family, friends from high school, my age, I have seen more issues with marijuana over the last, let's say 2 years or so, with major mental health issues happening than I ever have in my life. People just, I try to, make sure I respect the boundaries. Somebody I know, this person and his wife, both of them started using the dabs. About 3 months later, both of them were in the emergency room for 7 days. Had no idea the potency, the strength of it. There was a psychotic break on top of like a whole internal infection. So I think we just look at, marijuana as like, oh, it's natural, it's safe. And for the people that can use it, fine, like I have no problem with it, whatever. But we have to understand it's still very dangerous. To your point, it's not just this innocuous 20% THC, 15% that it was in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. These are smoking 90% dabs that emergency room visits have gone up 400% or whatever, something around there in the last couple of years. So
yeah. And then you take that, and we'll bring this together as we talk too. But now take, cannabis use all day long, but that's typically combined with nicotine use all day long. And that's typically combined with social media use all day long, combined with drinking the BFC, the big effing can of Monster. And I'm like, whoa, like that's a potent cocktail. And I was that cocktail for a long time. So I know it's a potent cocktail, but I'm like, hey, granted, we're not talking about heroin or cocaine or this or that, but like, there's a lot going on in your brain after you consume all 5 of those substances all day long for years on end. So now going back on track. So it's interesting you say about the marijuana. Yeah. So that's always my bigger concern. And then obviously too, with that, and schools are struggling with this, that there are, cause it's not federally legal. There are like, in some areas, it's still illegal. Like you're not supposed to have it, especially under a certain age. So like, I know that's creating some issues now too, because it's like, it's one thing if someone sells you a nicotine vape, no one's getting in any legal trouble for that, generally speaking. But like you could face potential legal consequences for distribution of marijuana, especially to minors. So I think that's just a whole nother bag of worms too that schools are trying to manage. I honestly feel bad for schools trying to manage all this stuff because that's the thing too. And I guess I'll talk on that. Like what level of responsibility do you think a school has for trying to manage all this stuff, especially with the limited, I feel like they have incredibly limited resources to manage it. Like sometimes when I'm in the school and I see all these kids vaping, I'm like, yeah, I'd probably at some points want to throw in the towel and be like, hey guys, we opened up a vaping lounge in the basement. So stop doing it in the bathrooms, go downstairs and just leave us alone. Cause they got all this other crap they're managing all day long. Yeah. So like, that's my question to you. What responsibility do you think a school has to actually manage these kids and parent these kids and contain this? Do you ever think about that?
That's a great question. A little bit. Yeah. Not, not in a super deep level, but now that you brought it up, I guess I would say, like, in my perspective, it would be for the school to set some pretty clear boundaries. Like we don't allow vaping. If you get caught, here's XYZ punishment, and follow those. That's a big piece of it. But as far as if the kids, get started in the first place, and then if they do get started, like getting them off it, I would push that that's more of a parental problem, because it's not, like you said, it's not the teachers and the school's responsibility to parent these kids past school time. And, also that's just unrealistic. It's not going to happen. Now, like a mini partnership would be the best if they're in communication and working on it both. But if the school has the clear boundaries as far as, understanding the whole habit and working on it, would be, I think, more of a outside of school issue.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think what you said about the boundaries is great. Now, on social media, so this is an interesting one, right? Social media is a huge thing. TikTok, this, that. I have my opinion on this, and I'm curious to see what yours is. So let's say we got Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, X, Snapchat, whatever other platforms are out there now. What social media platform do you think is the most damaging to younger people? Again, no right or wrong answer. This is just your opinion versus mine. What do you think is the most damaging one?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think there's different avenues of it. I think for young women, Instagram, it tends to be the one that really highlights this false idea of what they should look like or be like. And with AI now making, women's skin flawless, I've run into 10, 12, 13-year-old, young girls who are, spending $100 a month on, products for their skin because they're comparing it to Instagram, models' faces. That's AI, regardless, even if it wasn't. It's just not, that's not what our perception of life should be. TikTok seems to me, in my opinion, to be the most addicting. Like once people open it and get in it, it's like a really strong community in TikTok. People love it. You see what happened with, recently with the ban and people protesting and going crazy over it. And then I would say X and Facebook, as far as damaging for the mindset, because it just seems those two are like firestorms for fighting about politics and wars and any issue. It's just like, we'll throw you in with people that are just going to scream and criticize and rip you apart on both edges of anything. You could say the light behind me is blue and there's a whole group that's going to scream and say you're wrong and yell. And that can be just like, feed that anger inside.
That was a really good interpretation of each of those. I like how you broke that down to each individual category as far as damaging. That's a better way to ask that question in the future. I'll tell you one of my things. So I agree with everything you said, and I honestly haven't thought about that much and separating those out. The one I get most concerned about, actually, TikTok, I think is definitely like the most addicting. They'll spend, I'll spend hours on there. I've been sucked into that before. I think the one that I'm most concerned with when I'm in the schools is Snapchat. And one of the reasons being is because like I'll be talking to like, and these are not conversations I enjoy having or want to have. And I usually just say, hey, go talk to someone else about this. But like, they'll be like, oh, this dude was messaging me on Snapchat. Oh, this guy is sending me photos on Snapchat. And it's like, they're talking to like admittedly a grown man on there. And it's like, you're talking to like a 14-year-old girl on Snapchat. And I see that a lot. So I think from like and then obviously that has massive repercussions for that young girl's mental health and the outcomes. So that from like a predatory standpoint, Snapchat freaks me out the most. And even like Snapchat's definition, and I understand that things change. Like I get that. I met my wife online. So like I'm all for like online meeting and stuff, but like I'll talk to somebody since like, oh, I'm dating someone. I'll be like, oh, who are you dating? And they're like, oh, Joe from Snapchat. I'm like, oh, have you ever met Joe? And they're like, no. We've been talking for like 2 weeks. And I'm like, interesting. Like that's not real. Like I don't even know if Joe could be a robot at this point, to your point. Like, and I get that things change, and I understand that how we socialize changes and relationships change and how we have those change. But like that to me is odd. And then to go further, I find Snapchat to be, personally, that's where they're always posting stuff. That's where your plug's at. He's posting his stash. Swipe up, let me know where you're at. I'll come drop it off. Like I see a lot of purchasing going through Snapchat more than I do any other platform. And the only other thing about Snapchat that really gets me, and I'm not on Snapchat for multiple reasons, but one of the other things that really bothers me about Snapchat is its inability to interrupt the person's day. So it's like, oh, John sent you a streak. And then they're like, oh, I got to send a streak back or whatever to keep this streak going. And like, it's just like, I find Snapchat to be very intrusive. Whereas like, TikTok, I go on there and scroll. YouTube, I go on there and scroll. Like if I get addicted to that, it's kind of on me. No one's like pinging me all day long on TikTok or YouTube. Whereas Snapchat, I find, and even Instagram has a little more regulation on the DMs and how they filter them. So anyways, that's my thing on social media. Snapchat is the one that bothers me the most.
Okay, that's a great point. And it's funny you said you don't use. I don't either. It's the only one I don't use.
Same.
But a couple years ago, I got the wonderful privilege of filming an anti-fentanyl commercial that actually, for anybody who watches football, they played a lot during football games, a national commercial where we got to go into school and do a fentanyl awareness campaign. That was actually funded by Snapchat because they got in a bunch of trouble for all the amount of, just like you said, it is apparently the number one social media for people to buy substances.
Interesting. I didn't know that. That was just my just my observation.
No, you're 100% right. And in my answer, because I don't use it, I maybe not am in the world of it as much, but I kind of glossed over that. Snapchat and then the other social medias, to save face, help fund it too. They hired the ad council who hired us to film this, but basically there was some type of Senate or House hearing where the government was like, hey, there's so many people buying substances on your platform. What are you going to do? And they funded a couple of campaigns to help fight it. What that has actually done, I mean, our campaign was great. There's a couple other ones, but it doesn't seem like it's slowed anything down on menus being sent on Snapchat. But that's a great point with the intrusiveness, with all of it. And I think kids also don't realize, or many people, not just kids, the whole disappearing messages, 24-hour messaging. It's just by my phone, it might disappear. Yeah. It's saved. Like that's still saved. There's no such thing as it's gone.
I tell kids with their conversations and God knows whatever else they're sending. I'm like, hey, once you post it somewhere, it lives forever. The internet doesn't die. So like that photo, that thing, that's there forever for everyone to find and see one day. So remember that. And then, sometimes they listen, sometimes not. Okay. Now I want to go on some of that other stuff that you were talking about. So caffeine, I get a lot of shit on this. People constantly are giving me backlash when I talk about, I'm like, hey, these pre-workout products and these energy drinks, like these are potentially problematic. People are like, oh, that's ridiculous. That's not harmful. Why do you mention caffeine? What do you see in the high schools that you mentioned stimulants, over-the-counter stimulants? Why do you bring that up?
It just seems to me, everything I've seen going in and talking to these kids, outside recovery stuff I do, it's one of those things that, again, like many of the things we're talking about today, it's so accepted by society that it's kind of glossed over, and it's being put into so many products that people don't even realize that their entire life is now based on this external stimulus that they don't even know until sometimes it's too late, because it's like, wake up with coffee and then Celsius at lunch and then Mio squeeze with caffeine in it, and pre-workout that, the first pre-workout I ever took, I think had like 100 milligrams of caffeine, which is roughly a cup of coffee. I see ones now that are 400 or 500, and like, you add all that up, and I'll talk to these kids and I'm like, so you're having like 800 milligrams of caffeine a day at 16. If you need that for energy, there may be something more going on in you. And I think the marketing with all these companies is getting insidious too, to where they sneak it in a lot of these things, even like, hydration packets. Now you can get ones with caffeine in it. And it just, it's one of those like built up addictions that you almost don't know is happening until that day you don't have any. You have a wicked headache and you realize I can't function in life without, 6 different caffeinated sources a day. And it's just, I think they're really preying on kids and people, this whole, hustle, work 24/7 culture too. So it's a dangerous one in my opinion. And I use caffeine, so I'm not against it, but
it can become problematic. And that goes back to, and that's a lot of what I talk about. I say nicotine, THC, energy drinks, and then I say media content, including adult media content. I think when you take those things combined, which many people who drink Monster, like there's studies on that. Like if you drink energy drinks, there's a higher probability that you also consume nicotine. There's a slightly higher probability that you also consume cannabis. And the general tone of that is that you're less adverse to risky behaviors. So if you drink Monster, you're more inclined to do other things that are risky, which kind of makes sense. I mean, and that could probably apply to like, the crazy stuff that some of those Monster sponsors do, the MMA fighting, the crazy downhill skiing, which I'm not saying is bad or wrong, but it's just interesting that literature's out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I always look at it from the total point of view, saying, look, yeah, sure. If a kid drinks a Red Bull or a Monster or a C4 throughout the day, maybe not a big deal. But if it's like their second or third one and they've had a 24/7 drip of nicotine salt and they've had cannabis when they woke up and they're going to have cannabis when they go to bed, and they've spent 7 hours on Snapchat and TikTok and they have all these family problems going on at home, I'm like, that brain is just fried. Like it's just like it's taking a beating. Okay. Now, I want to ask you about online gambling. I have really no opinion on this. I understand gambling. I understand addiction, but it's never something I was in. And I was actually kind of unaware that this is something that you think is occurring in high schools. Tell me a little bit about online gambling and what you think you're seeing happening there.
Yeah. So both of us are in New York, and it's legal now here in New York, online gambling, a lot of promotions, and you see a lot of the big name actors, doing commercials for it. What I'm seeing is kids, specifically if we're talking about the teens, is they're seeing their family and parents do it like it's nothing. And so it's opening this door to where if they may not be doing a ton of it now, they seem to be getting more into it earlier on, or it's acceptable. Like in a couple of years, I don't really have $100 to lose right now, but like, oh, dad throws 300-400 every Sunday. I hear him opening his, DraftKings app and blah, blah, blah. And it seems to just, again, it's almost like slowly being watered down to be nothing, desensitized. That's what I'm seeing more with the kids. And then as far as adults, I cannot tell you how many people I know during football season. It is like every other person I talk to is spending money on that. And I'm just thinking like, I downloaded the app when they first came out, and I did one weekend, and I saw how I got into it so quickly, and I got rid of it because I could just see how dangerous that is. And the part of it with adults that was interesting too is, so I had a bunch of friends that were doing it after football ended. They were so into it. Literally, they're like, "Oh, I just put a bet on a softball game in China," and I'm like, "What?" And it's like, well, football's over. I got to find other stuff. Guys who've never watched baseball a day in their life, betting on baseball, betting on, Russian hockey. And I'm like, I see where this is getting deeper and deeper. And it's so accessible. Just pull up my phone, done. I could bet $10,000 in 5 seconds.
In an instant.
It's insidious almost, and the part that's really dangerous, like lotto tickets, is the government pushes it.
The government pushes it. I think that's a big one that you said too. It's interesting to say it. Like I said, I don't pay attention to gambling as much, but I've definitely seen the ads coming out from celebrities and this and that and all. Everyone's pushing online gambling right now. Yeah, that loss of money to me was always too great. So I don't watch sports. So that was another thing probably why I never got too into it. Like I'm not big into sports. I'm not into things. So it just kind of went over my head, which I'm glad it did. But
so
no.
One thing real quick, I'll add to that, and maybe you could give your opinion too. I did a seminar a couple of years back, and there was a bunch of doctors there, and they all focused on addiction. And I'll never forget, I asked at the end, like, what addiction they thought was the worst. And as far as like getting hooked super quickly was meth was one of them. Obviously, as far as like withdrawal and stuff, they were talking about opioids. But 6 of the 9 said gambling is probably one of the most dangerous because of there's not like an external thing going in the mouth and whatever, but the amount of dopamine it releases on both a win and a loss is something to do with how it's so hard to stop, and how certain problem gamblers even start feeling a higher high on the big loss than the win, and then the bars keeps getting set higher and higher and higher. They explained it. I don't know the science behind it all, but I'll never forget. I was like, wow, almost half the doctors here said gambling is probably one of the biggest ones to look at. And also one of their answers was because of how prevalent it is in society. Nicotine too, because it's such an addictive chemical. So it wasn't like but I just didn't even expect gambling to be brought up in the answer, and it was.
That's interesting to me because in schools, I don't know, but I don't think there's much conversation about gambling at all.
No.
And it's like, vaping wasn't much conversation until it was a problem, right? Things don't tend to be a conversation until it's too late.
Yeah.
And like, you make me think like, wow, maybe that's something that they should get ahead of with youth, especially with how you're describing how they're seeing it becoming normalized. Yeah. Maybe if there was more attention paid to that, they could actually get ahead of it and save a generation. But then, like you said, a lot of it's government funded. So do they really want to get ahead of it? I don't know. Because then you can get the government, they can pick up on the gambling end. And then they can also send you to New York State helpline for gambling, which is also government funded. So it's like, whether the gambling or they're in recovery with us, we're making money off them either way. Yeah. So I don't know. This gets gets down to some really shady stuff. No, Kyle, this was a really interesting conversation, and I'm sure there's more to be had about it, but I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about some of this stuff. Do you have any other comments or any other things that you'd like to leave people with if there's a parent watching this or a student watching this?
Yeah. Basically to me, we used to go in when I was in high school, they'd have somebody come in and you use drugs, you're going to die tomorrow. That's not the approach we take anymore. It's just about education and awareness. And, just if there was any parent or anybody listening who's struggling themselves, don't beat yourself up, but just, be educated on it and understand there's so many places you can get help. You don't have to do it alone. There you could reach out to people online. There's self-help groups, obviously doctors, therapists, so many different avenues to where whatever you're struggling with, there is people that have been through it that are willing to help you and, for lack of a better term, hold your hand until you can, kind of get some traction yourself. So don't beat yourself up and give up on yourself. And for the parents, just, keep an eye on things. We obviously don't want to be overburdened, but know what's going on with your kids. And I can't thank you enough for having me on too, and the work you do, helping so many people for years now. Talking about, again, everything we've talked about today that's not typically thought of when the word addiction comes up, so.
Yeah, anytime, man. I appreciate that. That's very nice of you. Well, Kyle, I'll say thank you. And, you guys can find Kyle at Sober Dogs, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. Go check out his content. And we'll do this again sometime. Kyle, I'll hang out and talk to you for a little bit after I end this. But thank you. Now,
thanks.
I'll end here. Good, man.